At exactly 3:14 a.m., Caleb Whitmore heard it. Not the wind clawing at the old cabin walls, not the groan of ancient pine under snow. This was different. It was alive. A sound that didn't belong in the middle of a blizzard. A low, broken cry that hovered just outside his door like a breath too afraid to knock. In all his years in the wild, Caleb had learned to recognize the silence of death, the chatter of fear, and the whisper of survival. But this sound was none of those. It was something else, something pleading. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Beartooth Ridge stood brooding and blue in the distance, a jagged procession of icy peaks shouldering their way into the Montana sky. Snowflakes fluttered down like feathers from the pale. Unfeeling heavens, cloaking the pines in a silence that belonged only to winter. The world here had no sound except for wind, no color except white and pine dark green, no company but time. Somewhere in the folds of this frozen land stood an old fire watch station, a weather-beaten structure tucked into the mountainside like an old scar. This forgotten outpost had long ceased to serve any official purpose, but it had not been truly empty. Inside lived Caleb Whitmore, a 52-year-old man who once lectured on ecological systems and predator-prey relationships at the University of Washington. Tall, slightly hunched from years of carrying camera equipment and personal weight, Caleb had a gaunt face lined with deep furrows. His hair, once raven black, had grayed around the temples like frost creeping across stone. His eyes, gray, sharp, and inward-looking, betrayed an alertness to detail, but rarely to emotion. Caleb had withdrawn to this cabin 8 winters ago after the death of his wife, Marlene. In a climbing accident he still blamed himself for, since then. Grief had settled into him like marrow in bone. His hands, large and weathered, were setting a kettle atop a sputtering wood stove as the short winter daylight began to dim. Outside, the wind gusted again. Caleb glanced at the barometer nailed above the door. The mercury had dropped faster than expected. That wasn't good. The storm on the radio, the one the weatherman had warned might snap trees like twigs, was moving in early. He stepped out onto the porch, pulled his oilskin coat tighter around his wiry frame, and began checking the external fuel line and generator. The scent of snow and frozen pine filled his lungs. Inside the cabin, the fire watch station bore little resemblance to its past function. Caleb had converted it into a modest but resilient home, lined with books on animal behavior and ecology, as well as several hand-drawn maps of the terrain surrounding Beartooth. A battered leather armchair faced a single frosted window, beside which stood a tripod with an old Nikon D850 that hadn't been touched in over 3 years. On the wall hung photos of snow leopards, elk, wolves, all captured in that unmistakable soft glow tone of a once celebrated wildlife photographer. He had stopped photographing not because he stopped loving it, but because looking through a lens had begun to feel like a lie. Life had become something to survive, not preserve. Just as he began to secure the last latch on the storm shutters, he heard the crunch of boots behind him. "I brought in your other lanterns," said a voice, young, uncertain, carrying a faint Floridian drawl dulled by the cold. Eli Whitmore, age 15, was Caleb's only grandson. Slender but strong, with shaggy chestnut hair and skin still sun-touched despite the harsh change in climate. Eli was more comfortable with smartphones than snowshoes. His cheeks were wind-burned red, and his breath misted with every word. The boy had arrived only 3 weeks prior, after the sudden death of his father, Caleb's estranged son Jeremy, in a car accident in Tampa. Jeremy and Caleb had not spoken in over a decade. Eli's arrival was not a reunion, it was a reconfiguration of loss. "You didn't have to," Caleb said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I know," Eli replied, shrugging. Their silences stretched long. Caleb found it easier to talk to animals than to teenagers. Eli found it easier to text than to talk. But here, in the mountains, there was no signal, and that meant, sooner or later, they'd have to face each other. Caleb nodded toward the cabin. "Get inside. It's going to get ugly tonight." Eli hesitated, then followed. As darkness fell like a curtain over the ridgeline, the wind picked up speed, whistling through the trees like a haunting flute. Caleb filled several kettles with water, storing them near the fire in case the pipes froze. He tested the satellite radio and ensured the emergency batteries were charged. Outside, snow fell in slabs now, not flakes. The mountain was disappearing inch by inch under its weight. Eli stood by the window, watching the curtain of white. Does it ever stop? Caleb glanced at him. Not for a while. "I thought it'd be quiet here," the boy said, eyes still on the storm. "It is quiet," Caleb answered. "But the wind's screaming. That's what quiet sounds like out here." The boy didn't respond. They ate canned chili in silence, the fire crackling like nervous laughter in the background, as Caleb stirred his food. He looked at Eli and saw the hunched shoulders, the too long sleeves, the lost look. He remembered being that age once, not knowing how to carry the weight of things he couldn't name. He wanted to say something kind, something human, but the words stayed locked behind his teeth instead. He rose and placed an extra log on the fire. Outside, the snowstorm howled louder. The thermometer read 20 centuduhu and dropping. Caleb checked the radio again. Whiteout conditions expected by midnight. Power lines likely to fail across the valley. The last words before static set in were, "Be prepared to stay indoors for at least 3 days." He glanced at Eli, now curled in a blanket by the fire. His face turned away. The boy's mother hadn't wanted him to come. Said Caleb wasn't fit to raise anyone. She was probably right. At that moment, a gust hit the cabin so hard it shook the wall. Caleb instinctively stood and walked toward the door. He pressed his palm against the old wood. The mountain, he knew, wasn't trying to kill you, but it didn't mind if you died. He thought about the snow leopards he once tracked in Ladakh, how they used the wind to move silently between cliffs. He thought about Marlene and how she'd loved storms, saying they made her feel small in a comforting way. He thought about Jeremy, how they'd argued last, and how there would be no chance now to say, "I'm sorry," behind him. Eli stirred. "Do you think the storm will break anything?" Caleb turned slowly. "It might, but we won't." Outside, the wind shrieked again, this time like it was trying to speak a language older than words. Inside, for the moment, they were still. The storm had become a creature of its own, howling across the Beartooth Range with unrelenting force. Snow flung itself sideways at the windows of the Firewatch cabin, and the wind screamed through the trees like the mountain itself was groaning. Inside, Caleb Whitmore sat by the fire. Watching the flames shift in uneasy rhythm, it was after midnight, and the cold had turned brutal, far beyond the reach of even seasoned mountain dwellers. The world outside was not simply cold, it was punishing. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable, a sound not made by wind or branch, not the groaning of ice under strain. It was a low, strangled cry, rasping and weak. Caleb froze. The hairs on his arms stood straight beneath his sweater. He turned toward the front door, unsure at first if the sound had come from his own memory or from the storm itself. But then it came again. A soft, guttural whimper, like breath snagging on pain, grabbing his flashlight from the hook beside the door. He eased it open just a crack, enough for the wind to bite his cheeks and force its way in with snow like needles. He raised the beam and swept it across the porch and the white field beyond. Visibility was poor. Trees were blurred phantoms. The air was a wild churn of white. And then, just at the edge of the light, something moved, a mound, no, something breathing, shivering. He focused the beam, and there it was, a snow leopard, her body curled into herself, half buried in snow, her thick white-gray coat matted with ice. Tucked into the crook of her belly were two cubs, no more than a few weeks old, trembling so violently that even from the porch Caleb could see their struggle. The mother's body rose and fell shallowly, each breath a labor. Her eyes blinked slowly in the light, not in fear, but in utter exhaustion. Caleb's heart stuttered. Snow leopards were rarely seen this low in the range, let alone during a storm like this, and never like this, vulnerable, beaten. He hesitated at the door, gripped by every lesson burned into him about wildlife safety, about predators, about not interfering. But then another shiver rolled through the cubs, and the mother adjusted herself slightly, pressing what little warmth she had into their tiny forms. It wasn't instinct that made Caleb move. It was something older, something human. He shut the door softly and leaned back against it, his mind racing. The back storage room. It had its own entrance, was separate from the living space, and still well insulated. If he could lure the animals there, they might stand a chance until the storm passed. It wasn't a plan, not yet, but it was something unbeknownst to him. Eli Whitmore, wrapped in a thick blanket and half dozing on the upstairs cot, had stirred at the sound of the door, though they hadn't spoken much all day. Eli had grown attuned to Caleb's habits in just a few short weeks. Something about the way his grandfather moved tonight, urgent, focused, silent, was different. Eli sat up and crept toward the railing of the open loft, his bare feet cold on the wooden floor. He saw Caleb head toward the supply shelf and begin gathering blankets and a water pouch. He watched as Caleb crossed the cabin, paused for a long moment at the window, then turned toward the back door, the one that led to the storage shed. The boy's eyes narrowed. His grandfather was hiding something. He descended the stairs carefully, each step quiet. When he reached the ground floor, Caleb was already out of sight. Eli moved toward the side window and pulled back the edge of the curtain just enough to see the dark silhouette of his grandfather in the snow, heading toward the outbuilding with slow, heavy steps in his arms. He carried 2 thick wool blankets and something wrapped tightly that steamed in the air. A water pouch, probably warmed. Then Eli saw it. Movement beyond the porch, blurry through the swirl of snow. Not Caleb, something lower, something alive. He pressed closer to the window, heart pounding in the haze of light from the cabin's porch. He made out the impossible. The hunched, snow-covered form of a large feline, motionless except for its shallow breathing. 2 small shapes leaned into it, cub-like. Eli's breath caught. He whispered under his breath, "What the hell?" And yet, even in his confusion and fear, he didn't cry out, didn't open the door, he just watched. The snow fell heavier now, no longer soft but weighty, a pressing silence that muffled even the wind's scream. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked softly, but Caleb heard none of it. His mind was fixed on the image outside, the snow leopard mother curled around her cubs, dying slowly in the cold. The rules of wilderness living echoed in his thoughts like old chants. Do not approach wild animals, do not feed them, do not interfere. But there was something older than rules in his bones now, something that told him this was not a moment for safety manuals. It was a moment for something human. He stood and pulled 2 heavy wool blankets from the storage chest near the stove. From the cupboard, he retrieved a sealed bag of dried venison, simple, unsalted, and enough to give some warmth and strength if the animals could still eat. He moved carefully, deliberately, without speaking, as if noise would undo the fragile idea forming in his head. Outside the kitchen window, the storage shed loomed like a forgotten barn, its roof thick with snow, its door creaking slightly in the wind. Years ago. Caleb had used it to store camera gear and field equipment, but now it stood empty save for emergency supplies. More importantly, it was insulated and separated from the main cabin, close enough to monitor, far enough to be safe. He stepped into the storm, the cold swallowing him instantly. Wind clawed at his coat, and flakes clung to his eyelashes. With a slow pace, he approached the snow leopard and her cubs. She lifted her head slightly, eyes narrowed, but made no move. Her breath came in ragged bursts. The cubs trembled beneath her body, their movements barely visible. Caleb crouched a few feet away and laid down the venison, then unfolded one of the blankets and placed it just between them. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He simply set the offering and retreated, moving backward slowly until he stood again at the back door. Then, without looking over his shoulder, he crossed the snow to the storage shed and opened it wide, turning on the small propane heater mounted on the inside wall. The warmth crept in slowly, barely visible, but it was real, from the upstairs loft. Eli watched everything. He had woken again to the sound of the door, and unlike the night before, this time he didn't hesitate. He crept down to the window, careful to keep the curtain edge only slightly parted. At first, he thought he was imagining things, a wild animal, his grandfather kneeling beside it. But it wasn't imagination, it was real. He watched his grandfather place the blanket, the food, saw the old man walk across the snow and open the shed. Eli's heart raced, not with fear, but confusion. He had seen his grandfather fix traps and lecture about boundaries, yet here he was, offering warmth and food to something that could kill him. Eli didn't understand it, not yet. But something shifted inside him as he stared. The snow leopard didn't move for a long time. The wind howled and snow piled higher. Caleb stayed inside the shed, the door open, waiting. He didn't try to coax her. He simply let the heat do the calling. After perhaps 20 minutes, the leopard stirred. First one paw, then another. She sniffed the meat but didn't eat. Her eyes remained on the shed, slowly, with exhausted resolve. She stood, gently nudging one cub forward with her shoulder. The other she carried by the scruff of its neck. Step by step, she inched toward the light and warmth. From the cabin window, Eli saw it all, the moment the predator trusted the man, the moment instinct gave way to hope. Caleb stood aside as she entered, her body low, cautious but unthreatening. When she reached the blanket inside, she laid the cubs down and curled around them again. Caleb closed the door slowly, his heart pounding, through the small window in the door. He saw her eyes still fixed on him, not with fear, but with something quieter. Recognition. A kind of truce. The storm didn't ease so much as settle, like a great beast curling in for a longer rest. The wind still moaned through the trees, but the biting aggression of the previous nights had dulled. A brittle stillness followed, heavy and expectant, as if the mountain itself held its breath. The shed stood buried halfway in snow. Only the top of the door and the narrow window visible beneath the drifts. But within, warmth flickered, small and stubborn. Caleb watched from the kitchen window, his breath fogging the glass. He had checked on the shed only once that morning, not daring to linger, through the window. He had seen her, the snow leopard mother, curled protectively around her cubs, their small bodies rising and falling, weak but alive. She hadn't growled, she hadn't moved, but her eyes had met his, tired but aware. The heater in the shed hissed softly, running on one of the last propane canisters he'd stored for emergencies. Caleb didn't regret it. He'd spent the better part of 2 decades documenting creatures like her, always from a distance, always behind the lens. And now, no camera between them, just trust, or something that looked like it. He hadn't told Eli anything. He hadn't needed to, that morning. Caleb had found a second blanket folded neatly near the back door, beside a sealed bag of dry lentils and a shallow plastic bowl filled with clean snow. He said nothing, only picked it up and took it out to the shed. Eli had remained quiet, occupying himself with books from Caleb's shelf, most of them too dense, filled with diagrams and Latin names, but he seemed more comfortable in the silence now. He didn't ask questions. He simply noticed, one evening, after dinner, Caleb stepped into the cold again to check on the animals. The wind was rising once more, brushing ice from the trees like shaken glitter. When he reached the shed window, he saw the mother leopard still lying down, but her body no longer pressed tightly against the cubs. She was breathing heavily. Her head drooped low. The cubs, still blanketed, nudged her belly softly. She didn't react. Something was wrong. Caleb opened the shed door cautiously. The heat inside made his face sting with contrast. He knelt slowly, watching her chest too slow. Her breath rattled, her body trembled. The cubs mewled now, a soft, high sound he had never heard from a wild predator. He turned and rushed back to the cabin, but before he reached the back door, it opened from the inside. Eli stood there, pale-faced, holding another blanket. "She's not okay, is she?" Caleb met his grandson's eyes. Something passed between them, concern unspoken, urgency shared. "No," Caleb said, "she's crashing. I'll help." For the first time since Eli had arrived. Caleb didn't argue. They both returned to the shed, moving fast but careful, carrying another blanket and a thermal water pouch wrapped in cloth. Caleb opened the door wide as Eli moved in behind him. Slower, eyes wide but not frozen in fear. The leopard didn't lift her head. "She's burning too much energy trying to stay warm," Caleb muttered. "And she's starving." The cubs had curled into her side but now pawed at her gently, confused by her unresponsiveness. "Can we move her?" Eli asked. Caleb hesitated, studying the animal's body. Her muscles twitched, but she didn't react to their presence. "We don't have a choice." They worked together, moving slowly, gently shifting the blanket beneath her weight, sliding her closer to the corner of the shed where the heat gathered best. The cubs followed without resistance, mewling softly when she was in place. Eli knelt beside her and carefully tucked another blanket over her hind legs. "She's shaking," the boy said. Caleb added fuel to the heater and moved the water pouch closer to her body. "If she can rest, regain some warmth, we have a shot." They stayed there in the shed for almost an hour. Caleb monitored her breathing. Eli sat nearby, watching the cubs. One nibbled weakly at the edge of his coat. Caleb almost smiled. "You're not afraid anymore." Eli didn't look at him. "Not of her." Another silence, then Caleb added, "You're good with them." Eli shrugged. "I think they know we're trying." They left only when the mother's breath had grown steadier. Caleb turned the propane up one notch before closing the door behind them. Back inside, he finally looked at Eli with something different in his eyes. Acknowledgement. That night. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. A wall between them had cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough. The morning broke without violence for the first time in days. Pale light spilled over the Beartooth Ridge, and the snowdrifts, once wild and windswept, had settled into smooth, silent blankets of white. Icicles hung long and glistening from the porch roof like frozen daggers softened by sunrise. The storm was gone, and in its place, stillness. Not the tense stillness of something waiting to strike, but the kind that comes when nature exhales. Caleb stood by the back door, one hand resting against the old wooden frame, his breath fogging slightly in the morning air. He'd checked the propane heater earlier that dawn. It was still running, though weaker now. They were on their last canister, one way or another. Today was the day behind him. Eli moved quietly, pulling on the same oversized green parka he had worn the first night they'd arrived. His hair was a mess of stubborn curls now unkempt after days without power. But there was a new steadiness in his eyes. He didn't ask what they were about to do. He already knew. They crossed the snowy yard together, boots sinking into the crusted top layer of white, the wind, once screaming. Now barely moved the branches when they reached the storage shed. Caleb hesitated, his gloved fingers resting on the latch. "You ready?" he asked. Eli nodded, voice soft. Yeah." Caleb opened the door. Warmth, faint but real, spilled out like breath. The snow leopard mother lifted her head immediately. She was stronger now, still thin, still worn, but her eyes had sharpened. The two cubs, once barely breathing, were tumbling awkwardly over each other, nipping and pouncing, their bodies gaining rhythm. Grace, life, when they saw the open door. Both cubs paused mid-play, their little tails twitching with instinct. The mother rose. It was a slow movement, but full of purpose. She stretched once, long, elegant, and then gently nuzzled both cubs toward the opening. The first one bounded out almost immediately, nose low, testing the snow with wide paws. The second followed more hesitantly, pausing to brush its side against its mother's foreleg. The leopard paused at the doorway. Her breath made small clouds in the morning light. She turned her head back, not toward the cubs, but toward the two humans. Her eyes met Caleb's first. They held no wild threat, no fear, only depth. Something ancient and unknowable stared back at him, something beyond species or language. Then she looked at Eli. The boy didn't flinch. He held her gaze with a kind of quiet awe. She blinked slowly, and then she turned. Snow crunched gently as she stepped into the open. The cubs danced around her feet, one bounding too far ahead and tumbling into a drift, the other sticking close, ears perked. She walked into the tree line, her body low and smooth, strength returning with every stride. Just before the last tall pine swallowed her figure, she paused again, one final glance over her shoulder. Then she disappeared into the white. Caleb closed the shed door with care, more gently than he'd ever closed it before. He didn't speak. Back in the cabin, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer uncomfortable. Eli stood at the small table with a pencil in hand, sketching into a spiral notebook he'd pulled from his pack 2 days prior. The drawing was rough, but the shapes were unmistakable. The curve of the leopard's back, the tilt of her head, the snow drifting softly around her. Caleb walked past him and paused. His eyes flicked over the sketch, then settled on the boy. "Nice lines," he said quietly. Eli glanced up. "I didn't get the cubs quite right. They're right enough." Caleb said, "You caught the feeling." There was a pause. Eli put down the pencil and asked, "Do you think she'll come back?" Caleb considered that. Probably not unless she has to. Eli nodded. "But maybe one day." "Maybe," Caleb said. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt at the edges of the cabin's roof, little drops tapping against the window pane like patient knuckles. The wind came and went, never again as cruel. One afternoon, Caleb and Eli stood outside together, tools in hand. The old storage shed's door hung loose on one hinge. They were repairing it, reinforcing it, fixing the insulation that had buckled under the weight of the snow. It was Eli who first called it the safe room. For emergencies. He said, in case another animal ever needs help. Caleb simply nodded, and they continued hammering side by side. Inside the cabin, pinned above the desk, was Eli's finished sketch at the bottom, in careful handwriting. He'd added a line from something Caleb had muttered weeks earlier. "Sometimes we save them, so they can save us back." Neither of them explained what it meant. They didn't need to. Sometimes. The most profound miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the heavens. Sometimes. They come quietly, through a child's sketch, a wild animal's gaze, or a man choosing compassion over caution. Caleb and Eli didn't just save a snow leopard and her cubs. In many ways, they saved each other. And perhaps that's how God often works, not in spectacle, but in small moments of grace, guiding us to choose love when the world expects fear. This story reminds us that no act of kindness is too small to matter, whether it's offering warmth to the forgotten or rebuilding what was once broken. We are all capable of becoming someone else's miracle in a world that can feel cold and distant. Never underestimate the power of tenderness and the divine hands that work through us when we listen with our hearts. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment to tell us what this moment meant to you, and type Amen if you believe God still sends miracles, even in the silence of the snow. Subscribe to our channel for more real, heartwarming stories that show how faith, compassion, and courage can still change the world. And may God bless every soul who watches with hope.